Our first speaker is Dr. George Gurguis, the president of Coptic Solidarity. Dr. Gurguis graduated from Cairo University Faculty of Medicine, having completed his residency training in psychiatry at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor and a research fellowship at the National Institute of Health in Bethesda, Maryland. Dr. Gurguis joined the medical staff at North Texas, Virginia Healthcare System in Dallas, and the faculty in Dallas, and the faculty at the University of Texas Southwestern Medical School, where he's now an associate professor of psychiatry. Dr. Gurguis spent a significant part of his career researching the neurobiology and anxiety and depressive disorders, and lately he focuses his work on teaching and patient care. Dr. Gurguis joined Coptic Solidarity in 2011. He is a founding member of the Dallas chapter and has served as the president of that chapter. And then he was elected president of Coptic Solidarity in June 2016. Please join me in welcoming Dr. George Gurguis.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Thanks, Gada. Good morning, everyone. I would like to thank you for attending Coptic Solidarity's conference. And I also would like to take the opportunity to thank our distinguished guest speakers for talking with us today. Their presence and your attendance indicates to me that you care about the Coptic cause and about Egypt. I look forward to their talks and to understand their perspective and their recommendations. The theme of this year's conference is Egypt's Copts, Faces of Persecution. Copts enjoyed a relatively satisfactory level of freedom in Egypt, in Egypt's modern history up until 1952 revolution or army coup. After that revolution, Nasser instituted several measures through the land grab, the agrarian reform law, which disproportionately targeted Christians, confiscating land property of Christians, churches and monasteries, the cancellation of the party system, which further marginalized prominent Coptic figures, and the confiscation of Copts' businesses. These measures marginalized Christians in Egypt, and Nasser, we noticed, was his role. He set limit in terms of setting quota. Only 2 cabinet members could be Copts. This actually left the church an essentially spiritual institution to deal with the government on one-to-one, rather than having lay people that can stand or talk for Copts' interests. We can justifiably say that the modern wave of persecution of Copts started with Sadat in 1972. Earlier on, he unleashed or released the Muslim Brothers, established Al-Jama'ah Al-Islamiyya, which was established and prevalent in universities and other institutions. While on the surface we think that he did that to counteract the Nasserites and communist forces, in fact, he had a different plan. Sadat himself was a member of the Muslim Brothers who bragged about participating in violent participating in political violence and assassinations. Sadat's fascination with Zia al-Haq of Pakistan, close working relationship with King Faisal. As a secretary of the Islamic Conference, he stated that he is going to make Copts shoe shiners, Masahin Gizm. His praise of the Iranian Revolution indicated as the best revolution or greatest revolution since the French Revolution. All of these indicate that he had an Islamization process for Egypt. During Sadat, we began to notice the subtle discrimination that existed during Nasser began to be blatant violent with large-scale attacks and large number of Copts being killed. These occurred in the incidents of Al-Khanka and Al-Zawiya Al-Hamra. Sadat condoned these attacks when he declared himself a Muslim president of a Muslim country. When Copts protested here in the United States, again, during one of his visits, he went back and put away the Pope Shenouda and under house arrest in his monastery. He attempted to split the church leadership. During Sadat, we witnessed state-owned media were flooded with the likes of Sheikh Sha'rawi and other extremists who started denigrating Christians and their faith with increasing frequency. We also witnessed attacks in Upper Egypt. Islamists in their characteristic garb started roaming the streets, intimidating Christians and as well as moderate Muslims. At that time in the 80s, we also noticed that Christian-owned jewelry shops were a favorite target for plundering. No lessons were learned from Sadat's assassination. Religious extremism and violence against the Copts continued during Mubarak's era with large-scale attacks in Abu Qurqas, El-Kush twice, Attack Hammadi, and ending with the attack on the Church of the Two Saints in Alexandria in 2011, shortly before Mubarak's demise. Muslim Brothers and other fundamentalist Islamist groups proliferated and were allowed to spread their fanatic ideology. Extremist Wahhabi teachings, foreign to the nature or character of the Egyptian, were imported from Saudi Arabia and were fertile ground in the society where education has plummeted. Egypt's financial woes left it open to the exploits of the oil, Arab oil, which further fostered religious extremism. Fundamentalist Islamist ideologies and practices invaded every corner of the Egyptian society, leading Christians and other religious minorities to withdraw and become marginalized second-class citizens in their own countries. Attacks on Christians continued after Mubarak's demise. The January 2011 popular uprising, we witnessed attacks in Seoul, Marinab, and Mbaba. These attacks, the loss of life during these attacks cannot be compared to the attack of the Egyptian army on peaceful Christian demonstrators in Maspero. Coptic Solidarity has chosen this event to mark its celebration or annual Remembrance Day of the modern Coptic martyrs. The 1 year of Muslim Brothers witnessed continued attacks on the Christian. However, one significant attack we noticed happened during that 1 year rule of the Muslim Brothers, and that is the scaling of the walls of the Coptic Cathedral in Egypt, the seat of the Coptic Patriarch. An event would be similar in its symbolism to attack on the residence of the Pope of Rome. Muslim Brothers suspended the parliament, the judiciary, and sought to establish a caliphate. Talk of applying jizya to Copts came up for the first time since the jizya was, which is an extra poll tax on Christians and non-Muslims, started coming up during the Muslim Brothers' rule. Jizya was cancelled in the early 19th century for the first time since Arab conquest of the 7th century. It was rumored during the Muslim Brothers that if Christians don't like it, they can leave the country. During the year of the Muslim Brothers' rule, 100,000 Christians immigrated out of Egypt. June 30th, second uprising and the army intervention, which brought an end to the Muslim Brotherhood, was marked with the pogrom against Christians, during which 25 Christians were killed, 86 churches, 3 monasteries, 4 schools, and 230 houses were burned. This was described by the Honorable Lord Alton as the Copts Kristallnacht, similar to what happened to the Jews in Germany. President Sisi just finished his first 4-year term and was recently re-elected. His calls for reforming religious discourse went unheard by the Azhar. Nothing materialized from reforming educational curricula. Salafis left to spread their extremist teachings in every corner of the society. Attacks on the Copts continued with ferocity that even exceeded those observed during Mubarak and even the Muslim Brothers' time. During Sisi's rule, we witnessed major attacks in Church of Butruseya and Abbasiya, Cairo, that when attack on Palm Sunday of the church, the cathedral in Alexandria, St. George and Tanta, and the attack on the pilgrims to St. Samuel the Confessor's Monastery in the desert south of Egypt. In addition to these attacks, what we noticed a consistent stream of attacks on the Copts occurring in everyday life. Copts are being killed in their houses. An elderly woman paraded naked in her village. A priest who's attacked in broad daylight, stabbed with a cleaver, and the cross carved on his forehead. With all these attacks, we don't hear any condoning by the Egyptian government. What we usually see is lack of political will to confront the mob of fanatic Islamists. The summer of 2017, churches were advised to cancel any trips to monasteries and summer activities. Some of the monasteries remain closed to the public until today. The summer of 2016, the year before, witnessed a spate of attacks which prompted Bishop Macarius of Elmenia to say, and I paraphrase, hardly 3 days passed without hearing of an attack on Copts. Arbitrary church closures in small villages by security forces continued bound to the threats of mobs of Islamists, which leads us to ask, with all these attacks, what has changed in terms of what's happening to the Copts that prompted USERF to drop Egypt from its list of countries of special concerns? While this is not meant to be a comprehensive chronology of the modern wave of persecution of Copts or attacks, what we see is that in the span of 60 years, since 1952 so-called revolution or army coup, in the span of these two generations, Copts and Muslims who used to make good neighbors are now isolated with suspicion, separated from each other. Muslims are advised not to befriend Copts, not to congratulate them on their religious celebrations, and not even share any social celebrations with them. What we noticed is the gradual the discrimination that occurred and was rather impersonal during Nasser's time gradually morphed into open violence, one person-on-person violence against the Christians. What that tells us is that a clear relationship exists between the rise in Islamic fundamentalist trends and the persecution of the Christians. The rise in violence and persecution occurs with the Egyptian government blessings, and what we see is a lack of will for the Egyptian government to confront these Islamist mobs and their attackers, despite warnings by several thinkers, Egyptian thinkers, who warned the government that they are running a risk of internal destabilization and lawlessness. Persecution of the Copts has many faces and has many faces. Up until the early 20th century, 50% of Copts occupied government posts. 50% of government offices and posts were occupied by Copts. Through an initial process of attrition and later on flat-out discrimination, we find that we hardly find a Copt in prominent positions. There is no Copt who will dare to run for president. No Copt could be assigned vice president. No Copt could be a prime minister. Definitely some ministries, such as Ministry of Defense and Ministry of Foreign Affairs, are not occupied by any Copts. The tradition of keeping two Copts with very weak portfolios in the cabinets has continued since Nasser's time. We definitely don't see any Copts in intelligence agencies, National Defense Council, or in the Republican Guards. If we look at the judiciary, there are only 2% of Copts in the judiciary bodies that occupy any offices. When we look at the parliament, the recent parliament with the large number of Copts, some of them appointed, some of them are on a restricted list. Copts represent only 6 6.5%. If we rule out the appointed ones and the ones on restricted list, the representation of the Copts in the parliament is only 2.01%. In the area of education, public schools trivialize Copts history. Almost 700 years, or 1/3 of Egypt's modern Coptic history is trivialized. History books glorify conquering Arabs of the 7th century and denigrate or put down Egyptians, indigenous Egyptians, with their Pharaonic and Hellenistic heritage. Of 18 universities, there isn't a single Copt who occupies office of president. Out of 960 dean positions, only 4 Copts exist. A developing country such as Egypt spends 6 times on Al-Azhar University as it does on Cairo University. Al-Azhar is beginning to attract attention with its extremist teachings. It used to have moderate curriculum. Extremist teachings lately in Al-Azhar attracted world authorities for producing extremists and would-be terrorists. Religious persecution by the government could not be more blatant than when it comes to allowing religious minorities to build their houses of worship. Until 2016, building a church required a presidential order. Now the order has to be issued by the governor. The new church law failed to, on its promises to streamline the process, make it more apparent. To build a new church, you are required to have permission by the intelligence security forces, by the governor. It's almost as if building a church is a security problem for Egypt. Rumors of Christians gathering in a house just to pray are good enough for Islamist mobs to attack the house, and the owner of the house will be arrested by security forces. This prompted Bishop Macarius, an outspoken bishop in Menia, to say that praying has become a crime in Egypt. Depriving Copts from practicing their religion aims to humiliate them, erode their 2,000-year history of religious heritage, language, and culture. Copts have been arrested for praying at unlicensed churches, whereas mobs, when they attack an unlicensed church, there is no criminal charges brought against them, and the rationale is the church was unlicensed in the first place. Blasphemy laws have been applied during Mr. Sisi's era more than ever before, and USURF report indicates that more Muslims are arrested than Copts. More Copts are actually convicted of blasphemy laws, particularly in the last few years during Mr. Sisi's tenure. Contrary to Egypt's constitution, there is actually no freedom of religion. A Christian can leave his religion, convert to Islam, or leave his faith for no other faith, but a Muslim can only do that at pain of death. A Muslim could marry a Christian woman. Their children have to be raised Muslims, but the opposite cannot be. A Christian cannot marry a Muslim woman. Orphans, it has been issued, a fatwa has been issued that orphans who lost both parents and become wardens of the state have to be raised Muslims. Denial, obfuscation by the Egyptian government has been the Egyptian government response as far as I can remember. I grew up in Egypt during Nasser's era. Copts are not a minority. Copts are part of the so-called Egyptian fabric, or the Egyptian society fabric. There is no persecution. The denial extends to the media, which will basically downplay or not even report on attacks on churches or on Copts. Since Sadat's assassination, Mubarak, and through Mubarak's era up until present time, Copts affairs have been relegated to the security apparatus. The church is and Copts affairs are being seen as not as a religious freedom issue or a civil rights issue, but is seen as a security issue. Denial also extended to the church, where we see as church authorities issuing letters to visiting foreign dignitaries and politicians denying any persecution contrary to the reality on the ground. State security has pursued every Coptic rights organization either to co-opt them, infiltrate them from inside, or disband them altogether through intimidation. The persecution of Copts exists both at the government and at the society level. Harassment of Copts and persecution and discrimination is a daily occurrence that the regular Copt faces on a daily basis. A good majority of the Egyptian society has now been brainwashed by fatwas that are supposed to engineer the society and not let people think for themselves. Numerous fatwas we hear about that have become common in the daily religious discourse in the society, fatwas about the farewell intercourse, nursing the male adult, how you spit toward the devil. These are all prevalent in the social discourse. And most recently, on a serious note, the Grand Mufti of Egypt 3 weeks or 4 weeks ago during the month of Ramadan issued a fatwa that drinking or eating during the month of Ramadan is not a personal freedom issue, but is an attack on Islam, quote unquote. The regular happening is usually after Friday prayers, where there is an inflammatory sermon. Copts' houses are being pelleted with stone, intimidating Copts and Christians in their own homes. Coptic women are easily identifiable because they don't wear the hijab or wear a necklace with a crucifix. They are open to harassment and even rape on the streets. A Muslim woman, dean of one of the colleges of Al-Azhar, gave a fatwa that gives license to raping and sexually violating non-Muslim women. On the TV, a TV anchor just recently, when the attacks happened on the Islamist mosque in the Sufi mosque in Sinai, she made a tongue slip. She could find that attacks on Christian is understandable, quote unquote, but she couldn't understand why would extremists attack a Sufi mosque. This tongue slip reflects the common mindset now that attacks on Christians are just normal happening, that it's not a form of religious persecution. Another attorney on one of the TV programs indicated that women who don't wear the hijab, it is justifiable to harass them on the streets. And he is also, while he is threatening the Coptic women, it is a veiled threat also to Muslim women, enticing them to wear the hijab to avoid any assaults. A supremacist mindset of a totalitarian ideology could only explain the underlying violence that seeks to subjugate other human beings and submit them if they don't share the vision of the extremists. Violence or discrimination or persecution against Christians is also observed in the so-called in the arbitrary reconciliation session, where the Coptic victim is forced at pain of threat, is forced to reconcile with his Muslim attackers just for the sake of peace within the community. Thus, we see a process of scapegoating of Christians. Conflicts that involve multiple Christian families defending their homes against attacks are resolved by forcing these families to leave the villages. Forced evacuation or forced migration of Coptic families has been the state security solution to these attacks, rather than bringing attackers under the rule of law. Kidnapping and forced conversion of women, there is a whole spade. Usually what we witness a collusion between the authorities and Al-Azhar. Women who are kidnapped are close to legal age where they can convert. They're kept in hiding until they can convert. Their families cannot meet with them, neither an attorney can meet with them to confer, to ascertain that they have converted of their own free will. Kidnapping of young Christian children for ransom has also been a common occurrence. On an equally serious note, the murder of Christian soldiers in their army unit. There are a list of about 10 cases that have been reported since 2006. 7 of the 10 cases occurred on Mr. Sisi's watch between 2015 and 2018. Just recently, a young Christian soldier beaten severely with signs of torture, and the army would say it was a case of seizure. People who were shot dead from the back even where that killing was justified as suicide. In closing, I've been recommended to give some suggested to me to give some recommendations at the end of my introductory talk. In fact, there are many. One can come up with quite a few. But I only have one recommendation. Egypt's economic foes are not going to be resolved with aid. Aid is going to not. Aid, financial help from the World Monetary Fund or other countries is going to not. Unless Mr. Sisi changes the culture of hatred and bring to an end this religious fanaticism, any change, any economic aid is going to be useless, and no change will be observed. Copts are the soul of the Egyptian society. Along with moderate Muslims, they believe in personal freedom, religious freedom, and responsibility. Unless this changes, unless the culture of religious fanaticism changes, Egypt does not stand a chance. Thank you.